As is the case with many of you, no doubt, in the course of carrying out my church obligations, I have lots of occasions to visit various church congregations. And oftentimes I find myself saying that it's a pleasure to be there when in fact that is rarely the case. But in this case, I can say with all truthfulness that it is a genuine pleasure to have Dr. Scruton in our midst and to be able to introduce him to you. I was introduced to his work many years ago by one of his early works called The Aesthetics of Architecture, written back in the 70s, if I remember right, late 70s. And that is a work to which I have returned frequently and always found instruction and enlightenment there. He also wrote a little book on beauty that is one of my favorite little texts on the subject and has been recently reissued as one of the little Oxford short guides. Roger Scruton is a fellow at many institutions. He is a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, a fellow of the European Academy of Arts and Sciences, a fellow of the British Academy, and a senior research fellow of Blackfriars Hall in Oxford, as well as a visiting research fellow, or professor rather, at St. Andrews University in Scotland. All of which means that his work is important and admirable enough that many institutions want to claim him as their own, and with good reason. He is a prolific writer. He has written many books, many articles. He is one of probably, at least in my estimation, the top 2 or maybe 3 philosophers who have written on the philosophy of music, for example. He is still frequently cited there, and it's a great pleasure for us to have him here in our midst and to hear him today speak to us. And with that introduction, I give you Roger Scruton.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you to the Wheatley Institution for inviting me to take part in this extremely important series, important at least for its subject. And I think this is a subject which perhaps has not been directly addressed by any academic institution, to my knowledge, to date, which is the subject of scientism and the abuse of science and the way in which that abuse is invading the whole of the academic curriculum and making it difficult for us to make the distinction that we need to make between true scientific inquiry and the fake substitute. So in my talk today, I'm going to be addressing the impact of this way of thinking on the humanities generally. Obviously, this is a huge topic, but I think all universities depend upon having humanities departments, which are, after all, not only popular with students, but the way in which many young people find their way into the life of the mind. And therefore, it's absolutely vital that the humanities retain their integrity in the face of this kind of assault. So I'm going to say a few things about how one might protect them. Now, I think there you are. My interest in this, and the interest of many people, began with an extraordinary debate that occurred in England in 1959, the so-called Two Cultures debate. Somebody called C.P. Snow, not now widely read, I think, who was a novelist who wrote semi-literary novels, something between popular airport trash and serious academic literature, but was also an establishment figure and a bigwig, ended life as Lord Snow of Leicester, had all kinds of official positions this side of the Atlantic as well as our side. He was invited to give the Reed Lecture, which is an important named lecture, in 1959. And Snow actually had begun life as a scientist and had always retained a kind of expertise in that area. And he argued that our universities and our intellectual life in general were suffering because of an illegitimate division between the sciences and the humanities. The universities had become split in two, and as a result of this split, there were two cultures. And he meant by culture a kind of expertise. That in the average dinner party, there would be those who knew an awful lot about science and could speak about science, and those who knew an awful lot about the arts and could speak about them. But between them, there was an impassable gulf. And he believed that this gulf was damaging the intellectual life of our country and leading to a general decline in standards on both sides of the divide. And this was gave rise to a very virulent response from the literary critic F.R. Levias, who's not now, I think, so much known over here. But he asked the question, is science a culture? His answer was an emphatic no. Science is concerned with universal claims to knowledge, not with any specific form of life. Cultures change from place to place. Cultures embody wisdom and experience which accumulates differently according to historical circumstances. But science is the common property of mankind and can be understood equally by somebody in this country and somebody, for instance, in Egypt or India, without going into any process of acculturation. This debate produced much more heat than light at the time, partly because Levias was extremely rude in his response. But it gave rise to the sense that there are two ideas of culture at issue here. One that anthropologists are used to, the idea of culture as a form of life, so that you can talk of the Aztec culture, for instance, and the other as the idea of culture as a range of reference, what we might call high culture, somebody who is cultivated or who has a considerable level of culture is somebody who is able to refer widely to things of the mind and bring them into relation with each other. The first idea of culture, the anthropologists, is an absolute thing. You either have a culture or you don't. You either are an Aztec or you're not. But culture, as we understand it in the university, is a matter of degree. Some people are more cultured than others, and so on. There's a great question, therefore, as to what this word actually contributes to this kind of debate. And this connects with an old dispute in the universities, the Methodenstreit in the German universities at the end of the 18th century, the conflict of methods. There was a division had arisen within German universities between the Naturwissenschaften, the sciences of nature, and the Geisteswissenschaften, the sciences of the soul. And the first was what we now call natural sciences, the second what we now call humanities. And this was an extremely virulent dispute, partly because, of course, people's careers depended upon it. You often find this, that behind academic disputes there is also a financial interest. A university has only a certain amount of money to pay on salaries, and if you can persuade the trustees that actually the humanities are not genuine subjects of study at all, and you happen to be in the science department, you're going to get a bonus from it. And this is what was happening in the German universities then. And it gave rise to this question, is there actually then a method in the humanities? If there is no method, then maybe it is true that they are only marginal to the life of the university. There's nothing that we can teach, nothing that students can learn that they can take away that will enable them to apply it outside the classroom. And this became particularly emphatic, this dispute, because of the rise of the hermeneutical method in humanities. There was a tradition which was associated in particular with a thinker called Wilhelm Dilthey, according to which there really is a method in the humanities, but it has nothing to do with science. Dilthey said that there is a form of knowledge which he called verstehen, which just means understanding, which is the kind of knowledge that we have when we relate to each other. You know, when I go into a room, for instance, and I see someone smiling, I am instantly in touch with his mood and his state of mind. This communicates itself directly to me. This isn't a scientific judgment I make, it's a kind of relation that I enter into with him. And we're all used to this. You know, we sort out things between us without forming hypotheses about each other, but rather by responding directly to each other as human beings. And Dilthey thought that the human world is understood in this way generally through our intuitive apprehension of the reasons that other people have, the goals they have, the values that they have. And this form of understanding can be transferred from person-to-person encounters to our encounters with human artifacts, with works of art, with systems of law and government and so on. So that this kind of understanding, he thought, was could provide us with a genuine method which could be applied throughout the humanities. And this method would not be the same as scientific method. Science is concerned with explaining things, and explaining is not the same as understanding. We know that from our personal encounters. You know, if for instance, suppose my wife suffers some injury, which disables her from responding to me for a while as she normally does. Perhaps she's forgotten who I am, or someone's hit her on the head and she's forgotten who I am. I can no longer understand her, and she can no longer understand me. We fall out of relation with each other. But when I'm looking for a cure of this, I go to a doctor who will be able to explain her. He can't understand her as I used to understand her, nor can anybody, but he can perhaps explain what's happened through some science of the nervous system and so on. Now, this brings me to the idea of what scientism is and how science can be, or should be, or should not be applied in the realm of the human world. But scientism, as I understand it, is the pretense of scientific method when considering a question that is not scientific. And we've got, our culture today is full of these pretenses. You only have to open an ordinary Sunday newspaper supplement and you'll find some expert on the theory of evolution applying that theory to the explanation of some human trait or other. For instance, sexuality, which is constantly coming under the microscope of the evolutionary psychologists. The evolutionary psychologists might come up with the explanation of monogamy, which seems to be a kind of norm in human behavior, by saying it is an adaptation. By shaping our lives in this way, we provide maximum protection to children and therefore maximum chance of passing on our genetic inheritance and so on. And those sort of explanations are all around us and are frequently used to replace our normal way of dealing with the matters in question. For us, the question of monogamy is much more a moral question of whether we ought to do this or ought not to, if it's permitted, if exceptions are permitted, why are they, and so on. That is an exercise in what Dilthey would call verstehen. It's an exercise in understanding the place of marriage in the human community and in the human experience generally. And it's not displaced by producing an evolutionary explanation, which is, strictly speaking, irrelevant. This is not just a question of passing illegitimately from an is to an ought, which is something which philosophers are quite familiar with, but there is such a thing as illegitimately passing from an explanation of something to the meaning of something. I'll give you an example. We all are puzzled when we think about it, about the question of beauty. What is beauty? Why does it matter? What does it signify for us human beings? And in particular, the sense of beauty that we all seem to share, although it is differently developed in each of us, seems to be extremely important to us. It presents us with episodes in our lives which are of particular meaning to us. And people set out, the evolutionary psychologists set out to explain the sense of beauty. One of popular explanation, which originates in Darwin, is that beauty is part of the process of sexual selection. That by developing a sense of beauty, an animal is able to distinguish the reproductively powerful partner from the reproductively weak partner. The example usually given is that of the peacock's tail. You know, we all know that peacocks have this huge tail which fans out and fascinates the female. And there's a huge problem in the theory of evolution as to why on earth that huge tail should have evolved, because it's extremely clumsy. It exposes the cock to predators, and it makes it impossible for it to fly away when attacked. So how on earth could it have evolved? And the answer normally given is that it evolved because the peahen was attracted to this big tail, and the bigger the tail, the more attractive it was to the hen. Why should that process have reproduced itself? Because, you know, the idea is this, that a peacock that can sustain a huge apparatus like that and still survive obviously shows himself to be better qualified for the reproductive process than any other. So it's as always, the female's preference which condemns the male to this apparatus which encumbers its life from birth to death. But it's because she prefers this that she, of course, fertilizes her eggs with a robust genetic strain. So there is this kind of process, explanation that's given of the sense of beauty, and various evolutionary psychologists have said, as a result of that kind of example, that there you are, that's it, it's all explained. Same thing in human beings. You know, when men waste their time writing poems and composing music and so on, this isn't actually a waste of time from the point of view of their genetic material, because it will attract those women who will pass on this particular disability to their children. And you see at once that that's absurd, don't you? Because it doesn't in any way explain what it is that we find in music or in poetry. Why does this have such meaning for us? That is a completely different question. Not to do with the explanation of this sense of beauty, but to do with its significance for humans. And likewise with the sense of the sacred. There are a lot of anthropological explanations as to why human beings might evolve a sense of the sacred. But they won't tell us what the sacred actually means, what it is referring to, where it is directing our thoughts. And there are a lot of examples that one can give of this process. There's a pressure generally in universities to squeeze the humanities into the box marked research, and because that way you can increase your level of funding from governments and other research bodies, and for that reason. People in the humanities latch on to any kind of pseudoscience that makes it look as though they're carrying out empirical investigations or creating theories that will revolutionize our study of this or that subject. And usually these theories have a debunking character. They as it were, undermine the pretension of the humanities to give us meaning and explain them away as really pursuits which give us power instead. And this is, I think, in my view, part of what explains the charm for many academics in the humanities of Marxism, Michel Foucault, the French sub-Marxist thinker of the 60s, and feminism and so on. These are all conceived on the model of some kind of functional explanation of the kind that goes on in biology. They tell us that rights don't exist, they're just ideology, that cultural norms are simply ways of reinforcing power relations and so on. There's even a musicologist, Susan McClary, who wrote a whole book proving that the Ninth Symphony is really a rape fantasy and so on. So the humanities become full of these pseudoscientific debunkings of the subject matter. And I think that was very popular in the 60s, 70s and 80s, but has gone away and been replaced by something which is every bit as misleading, and which I call neuritis. There are plenty of subjects that we are familiar with, which we know involve important literature, and it's our obligation, especially as philosophers, to study, like ethics, aesthetics, musicology, art history, and so on. At a certain stage, suddenly these were all replaced by something else called neuroethics, neuroaesthetics, neuromusicology, neuroart history, neurophilosophy. That's the title of a book by Patricia Churchland. The assumption being that somehow we'd mistaken this whole area, that we'd mistakenly been pursuing ethics without realizing that ethics was really about something else, namely the structure of the nervous system. Aesthetics, likewise. There's a journal of neuroaesthetics which comes out 4 times a year, has peer review, etc. I think most people, most academics in this room will be familiar with the phenomenon. To invent a subject, you have to invent a journal and the peer review process, which makes it invulnerable to criticism from outside. So nobody is entitled to criticize neuroaesthetics except someone who's gone through the process of corruption that the journal itself expresses. And to think that there is such a thing as neuroart history is an extraordinary idea, but there is a book entitled Neuroart History, which people in that field might be familiar with, by John O'Nions. So in this case, a purely speculative science is used to answer unformulated and essentially volatile questions. And what happens is that the questions are adapted to the answers rather than the answers to the questions. And I think this is one of the most important results of scientism, that in order to fit the humanities to the supposed scientific method, you first of all see what the method could prove and then squeeze the subject into it. I'll give you an example. Particularly virulent in the field of neuroaesthetics is a guy called Ramachandran, who's done a lot of research on mirror neurons in that area, which will be familiar to neuroscientists, if there are any in the room. And he wants to use his understanding of neuroscience to solve the great question, of the meaning of art. Well, he reformulates it in this way. What is the purpose of art? And he answers, it is not to depict, but to enhance, and therefore uses forms that more powerfully activate the neural mechanisms that would be activated by the original object. Okay, that's an explanation of why art caricatures things. It amplifies the neurological activity that the original object arouses in you. And he makes use of a well-known theory in psychology of peak shift to explain this. Now, I won't go into this, though we could talk about it later in the Q&A, but it should be very obvious already from that quotation from him that the theory precedes the problem and redefines it in its own terms. Because if you think about this as a normal, natural human being, you will surely quickly come to the conclusion that there is no single purpose of art. The whole point of art is that it is purposeless. As Oscar Wilde said, all art is essentially useless. But that is its use. There are things in human life, the purpose of which is not to have a purpose, so that we can stand back and understand and appreciate them for what they are in themselves. And of course, even if there were a purpose, enhancement is not a usual part of it. It's not as though all pictures of the human form involve bulbous exaggerations of the recognized characteristics. On the contrary, it's often the purpose, the goal of the artist is to minimize, to tranquilize, to set us at a distance from the thing. So this whole rewriting of the agenda of aesthetics in terms of neuroscience it presupposes what it should be actually setting out to prove, namely that the questions of aesthetics are neurological questions, and they're not. Of course, they belong to the humanities and not to the sciences. And you're all familiar with, I'm sure, a similar thing that happens in the evolutionary theory of altruism. The theory that altruism is a winning genetic strategy, that certain genes can engage in, which gives them a competitive advantage over the non-altruistic or purely selfish genes that are in competition with them. Now, you can, through the application of game theory, show that it is true that if creatures are so disposed as to cooperate with each other rather than to compete on fundamental things, over time this feature will actually come to dominate the community in question and gradually drive the egoists to extinction. So that's a jolly interesting theory, but it's a theory, for instance, of the behaviour of the ant, the soldier ant, which marches into the fire to defend the ant's nest, or the bee who stings the intruder into the hive, thereby fatally wounding himself, and so on. It's a theory of behaviour which doesn't involve any thought about altruism at all. It's not a theory which in any way enables us to understand what is going on in the mind and the intentions of the officer who lays down his life for the sake of his troops by throwing himself on a live grenade. That is real altruism, but what is the thought that underlies it? That's something that we need to understand, and it isn't explained by this theory which is so general that it applies to every form of life. So in general, scientific thinking involves theories that are borrowed from the context that gave rise to them and applied out of context on the basis of slim analogies. Here is another comparison between pictures as we understand them and the digital theory of how pictures are transmitted. We know how images are translated from life onto the computer screen, don't we? A digital program just translates the image into pixels and transmits them in code to the screen. That's a process that we are all familiar with, and you may very well regret that it's all around us, but there it is. And these images, the eruption of the image of say a picture of a woman onto a computer screen is not a mystery to us. It comes about because the image is translated by the digital camera into information which is passed on via code to the pixel generating hardware. And maybe something like this happens also in visual perception. When we look at things, maybe some kind of transmission of visual information occurs by the neural pathways to the visual cortex. But then what? This is where the humane understanding of things and the scientific diverges. The neuroscientists say that the brain interprets the information. At least many of them say this. But of course that's not true. It's not the brain that interprets this information, it's we that interpret it. We interpret what we see. And the brain no more interprets what it receives than the computer does. The computer is a meaning-neutral participant, and so is the brain. So it's entirely unclear what neuroscience could contribute to art history, which is concerned with the meaning of pictures and their historical relations founded on meaning. And I'll give you an example not really an appropriate example for a Mormon audience, but still there it is. This is, as art historians know, one of the seminal works in our culture. Titian's Venus of Urbino. It was one of the early Venuses that he did. He spent his life, the rest of his life, doing nothing but painting Venuses, as far as we can see. And they got stranger and plumper as he went along. Right, and to study this, to understand this picture is, I think, of quite an important part of any culture in any study of art history, because it was the emergence of the horizontal nude as a subject of study, and this attempt to put a woman in the full domestic context of her existence, as Titian does here, became a theme for artists, which gave a new avenue into the understanding not only of the female psyche, but of the whole idea of being at home in one's environment. You can only lie down, certainly when naked, if you're safe. So these are pictures of safety, which Titian was trying to produce. In Roman art and Greek art, of course, there were plenty of naked sculptures, but they're standing up, and when you're standing up, even if you're naked, you're to some extent safe. And most art historians would immediately know that when Manet painted this famous painting, the Olympia, that he was referring to Titian's painting. He's repeating not only the form of the posture of the woman, but also there is another woman in the background. Instead of the dog on the bed, on the couch, he has a cat, which you can just see in the right-hand corner, and she's got shoes on, and there's something horribly suggestive about her, and also quite aggressive, unlike the soft hand that Titian's lady has, which Mark Twain said was anyway in the wrong place. She has a hand which is used to struggling, dealing with nerds and cheats and scoundrels and so on, because this is obviously a picture of a courtesan. Right, so, and you're meant to notice this. So Manet's painting, if you wanted to interpret it, you would say, well, of course it refers to Titian's, and that's part of what it means. In other words, it works partly through a contrast. And there's an ironical relation between the soft, downy atmosphere of the Titian and the hard-bitten sexuality of the Manet. Now, and I think you could imagine what an art historian would say by developing that story, and what he should say. Those paintings are both extremely powerful. You may not entirely approve of them, but they are extremely powerful. They have a meaning, and that meaning comes out partly through the comparison between them. And if there's to be such a subject of art history, surely that's what it ought to be teaching us, how to when we encounter such images, to extract from them their human significance and make it part of our lives, so that we know, yes, that's a way of being, the way that Titian is presenting to us, and so is Manet, and it's acquainting us with the full complexity of that way of being. But what can a neuroscientist say about that would in any way impinge upon that form of understanding? The fact is next to nothing. The neuroscience of perception stands to the description that the art historian gives in something like the way that the pixels stand to the image. It describes at best the process through which we receive the information, not what the information means. And I think this is in general true, that art critics and art historians tell us how we ought to see things, and they assume a freedom of perception that is responsive to the whole cultural context. And that cultural context is really what the humane education, I think, is trying to get across. It's saying, look, you don't actually, in your untutored state, know how to interpret these paintings, but I will give you the full context which will reveal their meaning to you, and also enable you to go and find out the meaning of similar things when you've left the classroom. And that is a kind of method. So, but it raises the question of what culture really is. And I have to put my glass on to see the clock. clock, but it seems okay, isn't it? Yeah. Right. So, and I touched on this at the beginning, but I'd like to say a little bit more now, more philosophical. And we all know, of course, that we are animals, but we are also persons. And there's a great question of what the relation between those two might be. It's a question which is formulated in different ways by different philosophies and different religions, but it's always there in the background. How do I relate to my animal nature? Am I simply identical with it, absorbed into it, or is being a person another mode of being somehow? Does it involve the soul, or is there some other way of expressing the way in which I am, as it were, embodied or incarnate in this thing? Well, one way of putting this problem without making any metaphysical assumptions is to argue that persons exist in what some philosophers call the space of reasons. That's to say, they are things which are essentially to be interpreted, not to be explained and manipulated in the way that we explain and manipulate animals, but to be related to as creatures who have reasons for what they do and can ask us for reasons in their turn. So this interpretation is a relation that we enter into with each other, and persons, I think, exist as persons because that relation is possible for them. And one way of putting it is to say it's a form of address from I to you. Whenever people engage in a conversation, they're not describing each other. They're not carrying out experiments on each other. They are addressing each other. In other words, saying, pointing to them the implicit request for reasons, for goals, for what they're feeling now, things that will make the other transparent to them. And people become transparent when they show to each other their own subjective view on things. When I'm talking to you, just in a natural way, and not an interrogatory way, just simply talking to you in a natural way, that conversation brings your point of view, your subjective point of view, alive to me, and it becomes present to me in the dialogue. And likewise, my subjective view becomes present to you. This is a very remarkable fact. Only human beings actually relate to each other in this way. Only persons can relate to each other in this way. Other animals have relations, but not this kind of relation. And I think that once you acknowledge that there is this subjective view that we all have, we can then see also why culture is important. It's the process that shapes that subjective view, that makes it possible for you to present yourself fully to me, and vice versa. If somebody completely lacks culture, completely lacks any frame of reference, or can't, the minimum is he can't even speak grammatically, but suppose he can speak at least, but has no frame of reference, no way of engaging you through some shared experience, something that acts as a common frame of reference for you and for me, then such a person cannot fully communicate how the world is to himself. We depend upon shared meanings, on shared associations, and on experiences that have sedimented over the centuries. And that's really what we inherit, isn't it, from our surroundings, if we're lucky. We inherit, for instance, works of art that our parents and grandparents have found, as it were, particularly rich in human significance. We learn to appreciate them because they appreciated them, and they provide a shared frame of reference that we can all actually make use of. Everybody in this room can make some use, for instance, of the story of Romeo and Juliet. That's a little piece of culture that enables people to communicate immediately about the nature of adolescent love, to compare their own feelings with Shakespeare's characters and so on. I've just gave you a bit of art history, referring to Titian and to Manet, which actually does make available another little symbol and a little range of images and references that would make it possible for us to perhaps compare our thoughts about the nature of the domesticity which those two women were surrounded by, and so on. So art clearly belongs to culture in this sense, but in fact religion too is a part of it. Religion is part of the way in which we have of making the self present to itself. That's a somewhat philosophical way of putting it, but it's giving us the concepts, the stories, the beliefs, and also the rituals and the forms of worship which enable us to become clear about what it is that we are feeling and make that feeling available to others. And I think that that's how we should see the humanities. That they're disciplines through which the art of interpretation is refined and extended. I'll give you a little idea as to how you might understand interpretation there. It's the art of finding the subject within the object. And we, however, I think we've got a few more minutes. Okay. I just wanted to conclude by talking about something else which is in another threat to this way of understanding, a well-known debunking theory of culture. And this is Richard Dawkins's idea of the meme. Dawkins, as I think you may have come across, author of The Selfish Gene and other books of popular psychology presenting to a general readership the theory of evolution and genetics in our current understanding of them, and he is well aware of the fact that not all of our ways of thinking, not all of our ideas, not all of our claims to knowledge can be fitted into the scientific paradigm. But because he is somebody who doesn't believe that there is any other paradigm, he presents a theory with which to debunk all our rival claims to knowledge, all the claims that I've been referring to under the idea of culture. So he invented this well-known idea of the meme. The meme is a self-replicating cultural unit. As I say, it's like a virus, which, when planted in the human brain, uses the energies of that brain to multiply. One paradigm is perhaps the catchy tune. It's said that on the morning after the first performance of Rigoletto, the tune that you all know, of La Donna è mobile, dum 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 ba-dum, and that was sung everywhere, or hummed or whistled all over the streets of Milan, even from those who had not been at the performance. And we're very familiar with that, aren't we? The catchy tune, which is immediately in the minds of everybody around us once it's been sung. And that's a way in which a mental entity has propagated itself by using the energies of human brains, and propagated by imitation. The neighbouring brain imitates, etc. And Dawkins's view is that this is actually how the cultural entities replicate themselves. They are like parasites which seize hold of the energies of individual human brains, take up their life there, and energize all the brains around them so that they go on reproducing. The process of natural selection occurs whereby some of them are driven out of the psychic space because they haven't got the competitive credentials of the ones that survive. And that's how cultures survive over centuries. Why it is that religions survive? They're just the toughest form of a mental parasite. Right, and you can see why I call that a debunking theory of culture. It's designed to take away all authority that we might think religion, art, music, and other things that we study in the humanities have over our ways of thinking. There is no such thing as interpreting these things and finding their meaning. All there is giving a scientific theory which shows that in fact they are meaningless. So this is actually incredibly influential. And I'm not sure you all have come across it, but he's hardly a newspaper which hasn't presented some article recently in which someone has compared this or that human activity to a meme. And it's an appealing metaphor, but the question is, what does it amount to? The fact is that it doesn't amount to anything, because it doesn't actually give us any biological equivalent of the so-called meme. There isn't any way in which we can give the physical substrate, for instance, so to speak, of what the idea consists in. But it also discounts altogether the fact that we judge ideas, that we assess them and reject them, hold them to the bar of validity, truth, and virtue. The Italian audience of Verdi's day adopted La Donna Immobile, not simply because it was catchy, but of course because it was a jolly good tune, and they were prepared to make space in their musical repertoire for that tune, and no doubt had to let go of a few others in order to make that space. But this process of assessment is what we're doing all the time, and that is not a scientific process. It involves rather our ability to relate to things as expressions of the human spirit. So this theory, the theory of the meme, makes no sense of interpretation at all. Because it can give no biological correlate for the meme, it is unfalsifiable. There's no scientific method whereby you could prove whether this theory was true or false. It remains purely metaphorical. But I'll end by giving you a bunking theory of culture. I know it's not a real human word, but it's what we need. In fact, that to me is the real purpose of the university, to bunk. In other words, to sustain the modes of understanding that we've inherited and not to pour scorn on them or to undermine their credentials. And what I would say is that scientism is really a kind of magic. It's a reversal to reversion to a pre-scientific way of thinking. It involves using science to conjure things, to reassemble human life in order to exert a kind of control over it. The neuro art historian is trying to assert a kind of control over this complex area of human experience, which will give him superior credentials from the rest of us who merely understand it. He can explain it, and explain it in terms of its neurological base. But genuine scientific thinking, in my view, begins from independently defined problems and sets out to solve them. It doesn't begin from a theory which is then used as a magic wand in order to redefine the whole area of study. And I would say that culture has an independent reality. It's the sphere of artifacts that are linked to our aspirations and our ideals. It only exists because we try to understand things. It depends upon our ability to judge things and to pass on our judgments and defend them in whatever way we can. And in my view, that is what the humanities should be teaching. They should be teaching judgment, teaching people, students, how to distinguish the genuine article from the fake. And that, I think, is where we have got today, that because people in the humanities have lost so much confidence in them, they're not at all sure today whether there really is a distinction between the fake and the real thing. And there has been a rise of fake culture, fake art and fake scholarship. And I think that is another topic, but I think that's I thought I would like to leave you with. Isn't that one of our tasks as teachers of the humanities, to teach students how to recognize the fake and not simply to be taken in by it? But I'll leave you with that thought for the question and answer session.
Hi, I'm going to read my notes here.
Right.
So I want to go back to an earlier section of what you talked about at the beginning, talking about the question of method in the humanities. Ming Kwia Ma, in his book, The Poetics of Counter Method, he juxtaposes the poets Ezra Pound and Gertrude Stein. Ezra Pound, for him, is a poet of method. According to Pound, the arts, are just another science, just like chemistry. Whereas Stein, for example, her stuff is all over the place. It defies the method of even understanding, not to mention science. So one of the questions, or one of the problems, I think, with this is that, with his ideas at least, is that even if you look at a person like Stein, there's a certain type of method to her work. Lines like a rose is a rose is a rose, or there is no there there. They have their own type of methodological approach to language. And if you look at somebody like Pound, he would have been a horrible scientist. So I think one of the questions, I guess the question I'm asking is, on the one hand, it's really problematic, as you say, to just simply apply the method of neuroscience to the humanities or to poetry. But on the other hand, it doesn't seem as if we can eliminate method entirely from the humanities, or in analysis, or in rereading. Right. So that's the question.
Yeah. Well, of course, I totally agree that we have to have something like a method if the humanities are to maintain their position in the university. Otherwise, people will say, "What are you teaching?" A method is what students will take away from the classroom and then be able to apply outside the classroom. It of course, is very difficult to say what the method might be, and each discipline will have its own shape. In giving my example from art history, I obviously used what people know as the comparative method, and say, look, get into this picture, and then compare it with this one, and you will see you've got a way into this picture too. And by passing your attention back and forward between the two, you will come to understand a lot about what they're trying to say. And that is a method of interpretation, and it's not the only example, of course. But your example raises another question altogether, which is not a question about the method in the humanities, but method in art. In other words, the thing studied by the humanities. And you're right that, of course, in many ways, Ezra Pound is a methodical poet in the way that Gertrude Stein is not. And part of understanding those two poets is to recognize this. I think we're dealing with another concept of method. Bach, for example, is a highly methodical composer, whereas Debussy is not. That's something that you have to understand in understanding the two of them. And again, by comparing the two, you'll come to see quite a lot about what both of those composers mean. But I think that's if you like, a first-order application of the idea of method, and not really. You're not really talking about the method of study, but the method of composition.
Is this on? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I'm a musicologist and an ethnomusicologist, and I'll try not to venture into my own area a little, too much. But I wonder if I feel like it, at least in my discipline, the way you've presented your argument here maybe exaggerates the antagonism between, for example, music cognition, or what you call neuromusicology, and other areas of scholarship, because in terms of scholarly interaction, in terms of scholarly collaboration, I don't sense anything of the kind of pretensions that you described of a kind of scientific approach to music trying to overtake music theory or musicology or ethnomusicology. The other, and sort of a related question I had was, in your own critiques of, in your discussions of music and your critiques of popular music especially, much of your argument is based on the primacy of tonality, and specifically Western tonality, and specifically about a 200-year period of Western tonality, that criteria, the only justification I can see for that criteria is a kind of scientism about harmony. I wonder if you could respond to those.
Well, yes. I would say, I would respond to both of those by saying the following, that there is something to be understood in music, and understanding music is a very difficult thing to get across. And I would say that the kind of musicology that I would like to see has that as its goal, to help people to understand, for instance, just why it is that the symphony developed as it did, and what it is that is going on in a particular symphonic movement. And I would say that that is not something that can be illuminated by the cognitive science of music. I know there is a cognitive science of music associated with people like Lerdahl and Jakendorf and recently Timochko and people like that, which does try to apply to lift scientific thought wholesale from the theory of linguistics and apply it in this area. In my view, it's a collective failure because there isn't, for the reasons that I said today, that there is no prior definition of what the question is. And there is an answer which is lifted wholesale from Chomsky, and then an attempt to squeeze a question into it that is relevant to music. On the matter of tonality, this is not relevant to what I was saying today, but it is relevant to what I think, because although it is absolutely true that the common practice is what you referred to, common practice harmony, is a historically bounded phenomenon, it is also, in my view, a phenomenon that it behoves us to understand because it did actually amplify our way of understanding sound as music. And you have you can move away from it, but if you move away from it without having first understood it and understood what it is that you're moving away from, then you are starting something completely new. And you may actually not be able to enjoy the cooperation of your listeners in doing that, because your listeners have ears that have been shaped by the preceding tradition. That's why I think that the attempt to break completely with tonality has so often led to music which has not received an audience. But of course, I have my own taste in this. But I think of the arts as the study of the arts as being a way of expressing taste and also showing people how to make judgments about it. And it's the non-judgmental study of music which I think actually puts the ordinary student off it.
I had a question about the earlier statement that the brain does not interpret, it is we that interpret. What is that we? Is that a mind separate from the brain? What is this that does the interpreting?
It's the whole human being. Exactly what that whole human being is another matter, but you can... psychologists are used to the fact that our mental processes are not detachable from their surroundings. You know, that it's not as though everything that all my mental processes are in some way going on in here. They involve the surroundings in much the same way as any other life form involves the surroundings. And what we are, it depends to a great extent on our situation. So I would want to say that we can't necessarily give an answer to the question who is doing or what is doing the interpreting, other than that it's the human being in his full context. And I think this is important when it comes to asking the question, what can neuroscience actually show? It can, of course, show what's going on in the nervous system. That's its subject matter. But there's a jump from that to the question of what this thing means to the person in whom it is going on, the person whose process it is. Similarly, if you take the case of the computer has got an image of a woman on its screen. You can say exactly how that image got there. The camera picked up a particular array of light particles from a particular woman, translated them into pixels on a two-dimensional graph. That was digitized by code, and the algorithm worked to transfer that to the computer hardware, which produced out of it an image which was the same, or at least recognizably similar. That process can be described scientifically without ever mentioning anybody seeing anything. The computer doesn't see anything, the camera doesn't see anything, but we did at the end of it, because there was an interpreting being in the offing for whom this had meaning. And my view is that we can study meaning without knowing anything about that digital process. And that's really what the humanities should be doing, finding areas where meaning is revealed to us and studying it, and studying how we can discern it and gain from it.
One of the things that really interested me in the first slide was that someone had made the claim that there wasn't a culture in science. Speaking from personal experience, I'm a mathematician, and I've seen that even within our discipline, an algebraist will approach something different from an analyst, and a mathematician will approach different problems than, say, a physicist or a chemist would. How does this fit in, I guess, how is it that they claimed that there was a lack of culture within science?
Well, it's not... I was referring to a particular debate about this, which is somewhat in the past, obviously, but what came out of that debate was the thought that science has a method, and that's what defines it as science. And culture may have a method, but it doesn't depend upon that method. It's not scientific method that will give you a culture. And likewise, maybe it's not a culture that will give you a scientific method. There are two different areas of the life of the mind, if you like, here. If you take natural science as your paradigm, let's say theory building, empirical testing, the hypothetico-deductive system, and all the things that we know from physics and chemistry, that won't give you an entry into the fields of study which have defined the humanities. And of course that gives rise to the thought that therefore the humanities are just nonsense, or they're simply improvised or purely subjective because they have no method of their own. So that was really the question that I'm raising, whether they do have a method of their own. And I'm suggesting that they do have not just a method, but methods to do with, which are generalizations of those thought processes that we know already from everyday life through our personal encounters. Humane education is encouraging in you a personal encounter with things like art, literature, and music, so that you can, as it were, extract from it the meaning that it has for you.
I was just wondering if you could give some criteria or explanation, or maybe some examples of how you would differentiate between fake culture or fake scholarship. I know a lot of it is in the theme of the talk as a whole, but I was wondering if you could expound a little more.
Yeah. Well, I think fake scholarship, certainly in my area, is fairly well documented. For instance, when you have an author who introduces a whole battery of technicalities but never explains what they mean, and when he asks to define one of them, defines it in terms of one of the others. Jacques Derrida is a very good example of this. But and he's a very good illustration of the way in which you can fake things very persuasively if you're French, at least. I think that we have actually encountered quite a lot of these people in recent humanities disciplines, partly because they fill the void. You know, they give you a whole battery of technicalities that enable you to look like an expert, and even as though it were a scientific discipline. You know, Jacques Deleuze is another example of this. You know, you could talk forever about the Oedipianization of culture. You know, and nobody would ever know what you meant, but it would give you a pretense of theory. And I think there are a lot of fakes like that. Fake art is all around us. Ever since Andy Warhol, it's the norm, in my view.
My question is, it seems to me that...
Where are you?
Right here, sorry.
Okay.
Much of science entered into the humanities in order to give it a sense of objectivity. I wonder if the humanities itself can provide a sense of objectivity from within the humanities. What's your opinion on that?
Well, there are important scientific questions that arise in the study of the humanities. You know, question, for instance, what were the pigments that Titian used in that painting? It's extremely interesting. And they're not pigments that are easily available now. And, you know, how did he extract them and all that? Those are real scientific questions. But obviously they're not going to tell you anything about what the painting means. There is a real question though as to when the science will actually give you a structure on which the humane understanding can be hung in some way, so it gives firmness to what is otherwise a loose apparatus. This goes back to the question from the gentleman, the musicologist earlier. Many people have hoped, at least in the case of music, that you can give some kind of basic scientific structure to our hearing and organizing of musical events. And having done that, we can perhaps begin to hang upon that, the kind of account of what those events really mean for us that has so far eluded us. My own view is that these things haven't worked, but they could work. But you know, and they might give you a complete science of musical cognition. What it is, for instance, what is the distinction between hearing something as syntactically correct and hearing it as having a wrong note in it? You know, that's all musical people can immediately make that distinction. It's really interesting, and there must be an explanation, and people struggle to find that explanation. But is it going to really help you to understand why it is that that there isn't a redundant note in the first movement of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony? You know, once you've seen that there is not a redundant note in that first movement, you realise how great it is and why it is important for you. But that isn't going to be. You're not going to get there through the cognitive science. In my view, anyway.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, thanks.